More than 15 years ago, when I arrived in Waco to begin serving as your pastor, the church was unable to pay me a full-time livable wage. So for the first year or so, I was a bivocational pastor, working the night shift at Allergan. Monday through Friday, I would work from 11 in the evening until 7 in the morning. Then I would go home and try to get some sleep until the afternoon before I put in some time at the church office. But each Friday, I would force myself to stay up for 24 hours so that I could sleep at night and be ready to preach on Sunday morning, only to go another 24 hours without sleep so I could switch back to a night shift routine during the week. It was a rough schedule, and I don't miss it at all. But it was the only solution I could think of for the situation at the time. In this morning's gospel reading, Jesus was just getting off from working the night shift. Word had quickly spread throughout the town of Jesus' healing powers, and they wanted to experience the miracle for themselves. But as ready as they may have been to make their way to where he was staying, Jewish law required that they wait until after the Sabbath. The Sabbath was set aside for God, and there was no room in it for traveling or performing miracles. So even as Jesus would have been preparing to bed down for the evening, he heard an insistent banging on the door. Upon opening the door, he would have seen not just one person, but several who were sick and in need of his miraculous healing touch. And even as he tended to the people at the doorway, he could see crowds of people in the distance making their way in his direction, so he could heal them too. Judging from the size of the crowd, it was going to be a long night. And if he got any sleep at all, it wouldn't be until the wee hours of the morning by the looks of it. One after another, they came. The desperate looks on their faces, hoping against hope that he would be able to help them. It seemed like the night would never end, but it did. And as the weary disciples made their ways to their mats for a bit of shut-eye, Jesus slipped out of the house. After all the noise and commotion he had no doubt experienced, it's not surprising that he would make his way to a quiet and deserted place. But what was surprising is why he slipped away. It wasn't to grab a nap, but instead to pray. Although we aren't privy to his prayer, I believe it had something to do with refocusing on his mission. What was his reason for existence? His purpose? Was it to heal sick people? If the previous night was any indicator, he was definitely gifted in that area. In fact, the more he thought about it, that might just be where he needed to focus his energies. With the money that he charged for his services, he could build a mega healing center right there in Capernaum, which would accommodate the crowds that would come from far and wide. And he could use the money to feed the hungry and maybe even set up a scholarship or two for orphans and widows. Why, the possibilities were endless. But the longer he spent time in prayer, the more apparent it was that his mission wasn't to build a mega healing center, but was instead to proclaim the good news that everyone should prepare themselves for God's new order, which was in the process of breaking in upon the earth. For Jesus, success would not be measured by the number of people he healed or by the donations he would receive from his services, both of which could easily be entered into a spreadsheet and then graphed out for anyone to see the results. Instead, his success would be the lives that were impacted and transformed by his message of radical, inclusive love, which isn't as easily measured. Just how do you quantify impact or transformation anyway. Well, eventually the disciples caught up with him. As he heard them calling his name in the distance, he knew that his quiet time with God was coming to a close, and he no doubt thanked God for the conversation, even though he wasn't particularly thrilled with what had come out of it. And when Simon and his friends finally found Jesus, they were astonished at his strange reclusiveness and decided to take it upon themselves to restore him to his senses. Simon knew what Jesus should be doing, and it was not sitting in solitude and prayer. Anxious crowds awaited his immediate attention. And so we can only imagine the look on Simon's face when Jesus announced that they would not settle into a livelihood of healing in this lovely seaside resort town, but would instead pack up their belongings and hit the road to proclaim the good news to as many people as they encountered. Sometimes there's a culture clash between the agenda that God has given us and society's agenda. Sometimes God leads us into places that aren't mapped out. And sometimes we are called to the business of transforming and impacting lives which aren't so easily quantified, and which can be very frustrating for people who have been taught that success and effectiveness can be measured. A church's effectiveness is measured by attendance and offering. An employee's effectiveness is measured by the size of her salary. A student's effectiveness is measured by his grade point average, and politicians' effectiveness are measured by their approval ratings. But how do you measure joy? How do you measure a transformed life? How do you measure the freedom one experiences from being in community with people who are doing their best to live out the radical love to which they have been called? Well, I'm not so sure you can measure it effectively, but you can record it. You can record it with stories and testimonies. That's what the Gospels do. Very rarely do they mention numbers. Instead, they record stories of lives which have been transformed. And on most occasions, those transformations are through a one-on-one encounter with Jesus. Our effectiveness as a church and our effectiveness as individual people is not easily measured. It's certainly not measured by salaries and attendance and square footage. If we are at all effective as a church and as individual people, it's only going to be by the love we pass along to each other. And I haven't figured out how to measure love. So to the best of your ability, try not to let the numbers rule your lives. Try not to let society's measure of success influence your own calling. Try instead to spend some quiet time with God to get a sense of whether or not your life is in sync with God's will for you. And then move into action, doing what God has called you to do. And if you need to measure it, then measure it through the joy and happiness it brings to you and others. We are more than the tasks we accomplish. And sometimes setting aside some quiet time with God is the most important thing we can do. Amen.